Hey guys, tonight we're taking a fascinating journey back in time to explore one of the most transformative systems of trade and cultural exchange the world has ever known, the Silk Routes. These ancient trade routes, stretching from China all the way to Europe and beyond, connected distant civilizations and changed the course of history in ways you might not expect. Picture yourself traversing across vast deserts, bustling markets, and snowy mountain passes as merchants, travelers, and adventurers made their way along these routes, exchanging not just goods, but ideas, religions, and technologies. It's a journey that forever altered the world, and we're diving deep into how it all happened. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, don't forget to post your location and local time. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Silk Routes were much more than just roads for trading precious silk. They were lifelines that connected East and West, bridging gaps between empires, cultures, and societies. Through these routes, goods like silk, spices, precious metals, and even tea flowed across continents, bringing prosperity and innovation. But the impact wasn't limited to trade. It was through these routes that knowledge was shared, religions were spread, and cultures intermingled. The Silk Routes weren't just about moving material wealth, they were about moving ideas, philosophies, and even entire ways of life across the globe. It's hard to imagine just how much they transformed the world we live in, but tonight we'll explore the unbelievable story of how these roads and the exchanges that took place on them changed everything. To understand how the Silk Routes changed the world, we first need to go back to where it all began. The story of the Silk Road starts in ancient China, around the 2nd century BCE, during the Han Dynasty. China, at the time, was a prosperous and powerful empire, with one of the most coveted goods in the world, silk. The Chinese had been perfecting the art of silk weaving for centuries, and the fabric was highly prized by neighboring civilizations for its beauty, rarity, and luxurious feel. But silk wasn't the only thing China had to offer. As the empire grew, it began to realize that it could exchange not just silk, but a host of other goods, spices, tea, porcelain, and more, across long distances. The question was, how could China get these goods to other parts of the world? The answer lay in the creation of the Silk Roads. This network of trade routes would stretch across Asia and reach all the way to Europe, facilitating the exchange of goods, culture, and knowledge between East and West. The first major push to connect China to the West came during the Han Dynasty, when Emperor Wu sent the explorer Zhang Qian on a diplomatic mission to Central Asia. Zhang Qian's mission, though initially unsuccessful in terms of diplomacy, provided critical information about the lands to the west of China. Upon his return, he reported on the powerful empires of the West, including the Parthian Empire, which controlled much of the area between China and the Roman Empire. The information Zhang Qian gathered laid the groundwork for establishing trade routes to these regions, which would later become part of the sprawling Silk Routes. Historians still argue whether these early connections were strictly motivated by the desire for trade, or whether they were also driven by diplomatic and cultural curiosity. Some suggest that China's interest in the West was largely centered around gaining access to horses, which were essential for the empire's military strength, while others believe that the primary motivation was economic, with silk as the key commodity driving the exchange. Either way, Zhang Qian's journey marked the beginning of a new era of interconnectedness between East and West. Once the initial connections were made, the Silk Roads began to evolve and expand. The route grew over centuries, incorporating paths across Central Asia, through Persia, and into the Mediterranean. The exchange of goods wasn't one-sided either. While China was the prime exporter of silk, other regions along the route, like India and Persia, contributed spices, textiles, and even valuable stones. Rome, with its vast empire, was one of the major destinations for silk, and as trade grew, so did the interest in the cultural exchanges that accompanied it. As you settle in tonight and drift into sleep, think of the long and winding paths that stretched across Asia, connecting civilizations that were thousands of miles apart. The Silk Roads didn't just carry goods, they were the routes along which cultures and societies met, mingled, and shaped each other's futures. What might it have been like to walk those paths, with the promise of new discoveries, and the silent weight of ancient history all around you? It's a peaceful thought, isn't it? And just like those early travelers, we too continue to build connections in our own lives, often in ways we don't even realize. As we continue our journey through the incredible story of the Silk Roads, let's explore how this network of trade routes became the bridge that connected the East and West. The Silk Roads were not just one continuous road, but a vast web of interconnected paths that linked many civilizations, from the Chinese Empire to the Roman Empire, and beyond. The route stretched over 4,000 miles, passing through deserts, mountains, and even across seas, creating a dynamic corridor of exchange between different cultures, religions, and societies. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Silk Roads was how they allowed for the movement of not just goods, but ideas and cultures. As goods like silk, spices, and precious metals were traded, merchants, travelers, and diplomats carried with them knowledge, philosophies, and technologies that would profoundly change the world. From the papermaking techniques that traveled from China to the West, to the spread of Buddhism from India to Central Asia and China, the Silk Roads played a central role in shaping the intellectual and religious landscapes of both the East and West. The exchange wasn't just economic, it was cultural. Think of the cities along the route, like Samarkand and Baghdad, which became thriving centers of learning and cultural exchange. These cities were melting pots, where scholars and traders from different cultures and backgrounds came together to share ideas, art, and scientific knowledge. The thriving intellectual culture that emerged in these cities was a direct result of the connections made along the Silk Roads. Perhaps one of the most significant exchanges was the spread of religions. Buddhism traveled from India to China via the Silk Roads, influencing not only the spiritual lives of the people but also their art and architecture. The route also facilitated the spread of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula to Central Asia, and from there, further east and west. Christianity, too, spread along the Silk Roads, moving from the Mediterranean region into Central Asia and beyond. Historians still debate how much the spread of ideas and religions was a direct result of the trade, or whether these exchanges were driven more by the movement of people than by the movement of goods. Some argue that the cultural exchange along the Silk Roads was primarily a byproduct of the active trade, while others suggest that ideas and religious beliefs were the driving force behind the desire to create and expand these routes. Whatever the case, it's clear that the Silk Roads acted as a conduit for intellectual, spiritual, and cultural exchanges that changed the course of human history. As you rest tonight, think of the ancient travelers and traders who crossed deserts, mountains, and seas, carrying with them not just silk or spices, but the knowledge and philosophies of their cultures. Imagine what it must have been like to meet people from far-flung lands, each with their own beliefs, customs, and knowledge to share. It's a reminder that even in the quiet moments of rest, there's always the potential for connection and discovery, just like those early travelers found on the Silk Roads. Now that we've explored how the Silk Roads connected different parts of the world and facilitated the exchange of ideas, let's zoom in on one of the most iconic commodities to travel these routes, silk. When we think of silk, we often associate it with luxury, elegance, and wealth, and for good reason. Silk wasn't just any material, it was the epitome of high status and the most sought-after item in trade. From China, where it was first made, to the markets of Rome, Persia, and beyond, silk became a powerful symbol of prestige and exclusivity. The journey of silk from China to the West is nothing short of fascinating. China, having kept the secrets of silk production for centuries, had a monopoly on the trade of this delicate and prized fabric. The method of harvesting silk from silkworms, spinning it into thread, and weaving it into fabric was a closely guarded secret. For centuries, the Chinese guarded this secret so well that the production of silk remained confined to China, making it one of the most coveted goods in the ancient world. Those who traded silk made fortunes, and the fabric became a symbol of wealth, sophistication, and power. Historians still debate the role of silk in shaping trade along the Silk Roads. Some argue that silk was the key driving force behind the creation and maintenance of these trade routes, as it was so valuable that it created an economic engine. Others suggest that while silk was certainly an important commodity, the exchange of other goods, ideas, and cultural practices was just as crucial to the development of the Silk Roads. Regardless of the debate, what remains clear is that silk held a unique place in the minds of people across the ancient world. For the upper classes in the Roman Empire, Persia, and later Byzantium, silk was more than just a fabric, it was a symbol of refinement and sophistication. Wearing silk was a statement of social status, and it was often reserved for the elite. Roman emperors and wealthy aristocrats were known to wear silk robes, and these garments were often reserved for important ceremonies, such as triumphal processions or imperial banquets. In this sense, silk wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was an item that reinforced the social hierarchies of the time, marking those who could afford it as powerful and influential. Silk wasn't just for clothing either. It was used in a wide range of luxurious items, including tapestries, cushions, and curtains. In the Byzantine Empire, silk was woven into intricate patterns and used in religious artifacts, as well as in the clothing of priests and royalty. The importance of silk in these cultures cannot be overstated. It wasn't just a luxury good, it was a key part of the cultural fabric, literally and figuratively, of many ancient civilizations. Interestingly, the desire for silk wasn't limited to the elite. Even the middle and lower classes sought silk, although they had to settle for silk blends or cheaper alternatives made from cotton or wool. The trade in silk also fueled the growth of many cities along the Silk Roads, where merchants would bring their goods, often in exchange for silk, creating a bustling marketplace of culture, ideas, and commerce. The desire for silk continued to grow as the centuries passed, and the influence of this precious fabric only increased with time. As you settle into rest tonight, think of the journey that silk took from the distant lands of China, through deserts, mountains, and empires, making its way to far-flung corners of the world. Silk wasn't just a fabric, it was a symbol, a commodity that connected cultures, civilizations, and people across time and space. Just like the trade routes themselves, silk is a reminder of how goods, ideas, and symbols can travel, leaving behind traces of their influence in places far beyond where they began. As we continue exploring the incredible Silk Roads, let's pause to look at the role of caravanserais, those humble yet vital structures that dotted the trade routes. Caravanserais were inns, resting places for merchants, travelers, and animals, providing them with a place to rest, eat, and recover from long days of travel. While the Silk Roads might bring to mind images of bustling marketplaces and grand palaces, the caravanserais were just as important to the smooth functioning of the routes, providing the necessary infrastructure for people to rest and replenish for the journey ahead. Caravanserais were often located at strategic points along the trade routes, usually at the edges of towns or in more remote areas where travelers might need a safe haven. Picture yourself in one of these caravanserais, nestled between vast stretches of desert or perched near mountainous terrain. The air is filled with the low murmur of conversation as traders and travelers, from different cultures and backgrounds, mingle and rest after a long day of travel. The caravanserai was not just a place to sleep, it was a social hub, a crossroads of different cultures and stories. Merchants traded goods, shared news, and exchanged ideas in these bustling stops along the Silk Roads. The importance of caravanserais cannot be understated. As merchants and travelers embarked on their journeys along the Silk Roads, they needed places to sleep, store goods, and ensure their animals were well fed and rested. Caravanserais provided just that, safe, secure spaces where travelers could take refuge. These facilities typically had large courtyards where caravans could park their camels, horses, and donkeys. Inside, there were rooms for sleeping and space for storing valuable goods. In many cases, caravanserais also included small shops where travelers could buy food, water, and supplies to continue their journey. While the larger cities and trading hubs along the Silk Roads were known for their bustling markets, caravanserais represented a quieter, more personal side of the trade routes. For many merchants, the caravanserais were as much a part of their journey as the destinations themselves. They offered respite from the often dangerous and difficult conditions of the roads, and they provided a place where travelers could connect with others who were on similar journeys. The sense of camaraderie that developed in these resting places was an essential part of the Silk Road's success. It was a place where goods, ideas, and cultures were exchanged in ways that wouldn't have been possible without the caravanserais. Historians still debate how much of the success of the Silk Roads was due to the infrastructure of the caravanserais. Some argue that without these crucial stops, the Silk Roads would never have been able to function as efficiently as they did. Others suggest that the caravanserais were simply one of many supporting elements of the larger trade networks, and their impact might be overstated. Either way, it's clear that the caravanserais were indispensable to the functioning of the Silk Roads. They weren't just places to rest, they were a vital part of the daily rhythm that allowed goods, people, and ideas to move across vast distances. As you settle in for your own rest tonight, imagine what it might have been like to travel the ancient Silk Roads. Picture yourself arriving at a caravanserai after a long journey, welcomed by the warmth and hospitality of those who knew the value of rest. Like the travelers of old, we too find comfort in those moments of pause, those quiet, sacred spaces that allow us to recharge before we continue on our own journeys. Whether it's the silence of a peaceful room or the sounds of a bustling marketplace, rest remains a fundamental part of our lives, just as it was for the merchants of the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads were not just about trading goods, such as silk, spices, and precious metals. These ancient trade routes also served as a vital conduit for the spread of religious ideas and philosophies across continents. Just as merchants carried their wares from the east to the west, so too did ideas, beliefs, and spiritual practices travel in both directions. The Silk Roads became a pathway for cultural exchange, where ideas were shared between vastly different civilizations, and religions like Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity spread far beyond their places of origin. One of the most significant religions to travel along the Silk Roads was Buddhism. Originating in India, Buddhism began its journey eastward toward China, then through Central Asia and beyond, influencing millions of people along the way. The spread of Buddhism was facilitated by trade, as merchants, missionaries, and monks carried the teachings and practices of the Buddha from one region to another. It was through the Silk Roads that Buddhist texts, statues, and religious practices were introduced to Central Asia, China, Korea, and eventually Japan. Buddhist monasteries and temples were established along the trade routes, providing places for travelers to rest and offering opportunities for cultural exchange. In fact, one of the most famous and important landmarks along the Silk Roads is the Dunhuang Caves in China, where Buddhist art and scriptures were preserved for centuries. The caves were part of the vast network of trade routes and became a hub for Buddhist monks and traders. Today, these caves are a testament to the power of the Silk Roads in spreading religious ideas and preserving cultural heritage. At the same time, Islam also spread along the Silk Roads, particularly during the period of the Arab Caliphates. As the Islamic Empire expanded from the Arabian Peninsula into Persia, Central Asia, and beyond, Islam traveled alongside the trade routes, bringing with it new cultural practices, legal systems, and spiritual beliefs. Cities like Samarkand and Baghdad became important centers of Islamic learning, where scholars from various parts of the world gathered to discuss and develop new ideas in science, mathematics, and philosophy. As Islam spread along the Silk Roads, it blended with the local cultures and traditions, resulting in the rich diversity of Islamic practice that we see today. Historians still debate how much the Silk Roads were responsible for the spread of these religions, or whether other factors, such as political power, conquest, or missionary work, played a more significant role. Some argue that the exchange of goods, along with the movement of people, was the primary catalyst for the diffusion of religious ideas, while others suggest that the Silk Roads merely provided a convenient infrastructure that allowed for the further spread of ideas already in motion. What is clear, however, is that the Silk Roads acted as a bridge between worlds, allowing the exchange of beliefs, philosophies, and religious practices that forever changed the cultural landscape of the ancient world. In addition to the major religions, philosophical ideas also found their way along the Silk Roads. For example, Confucianism, which had shaped the social and political systems of China for centuries, began to spread to neighboring regions through the trade routes. The philosophical teachings of Confucius, emphasizing morality, family relationships, and social harmony, resonated with other cultures along the Silk Roads, contributing to the development of shared intellectual traditions. As you drift into sleep tonight, imagine the quiet exchange of spiritual knowledge between the traders, monks, and scholars who traveled the Silk Roads. Picture the peaceful spread of ideas, where teachings, philosophies, and religions from distant lands met and mingled, shaping the world in ways we can still feel today. The movement of ideas was as much a part of the Silk Roads as the exchange of goods, and the legacy of that cultural and spiritual exchange continues to resonate across the globe. Just as these ideas traveled long distances, so too do our own thoughts and beliefs reach across time, linking us to the past and to one another in quiet, meaningful ways. As we continue to explore the incredible impact of the Silk Roads, it's important to look at how this vast network of trade routes was also a conduit for the exchange of knowledge and technology. Much like the physical goods that passed along these roads, innovations in science, medicine, engineering, and even art traveled from one civilization to another, profoundly changing the societies they touched. The Silk Roads weren't just about trade, they were about the exchange of ideas that helped shape the world as we know it today. One of the most significant exchanges along the Silk Roads was in the field of science and technology. For example, the art of papermaking traveled westward from China, where it was first developed during the Han Dynasty. Paper had a profound impact on civilization, as it made writing and record-keeping more accessible and efficient. Before paper, people wrote on expensive materials like parchment, which was not only costly but also difficult to maintain. The introduction of paper allowed for the spread of literacy and learning across the Silk Roads, helping to create an intellectual and cultural exchange between the East and West. Alongside paper, the knowledge of printing techniques also spread, as Chinese block printing and movable type influenced the development of printing in Europe. This exchange ultimately paved the way for the mass production of books, newspapers, and other printed materials, fueling the spread of knowledge during the Renaissance and beyond. The movement of this technological knowledge, facilitated by the Silk Roads, transformed not just the way people communicated but also how they recorded history and shared ideas. In addition to paper, the Silk Roads were instrumental in spreading other scientific innovations. The knowledge of gunpowder, for instance, traveled from China through the Middle East and into Europe, where it would have a profound impact on warfare and technological development. Similarly, the ancient art of silk weaving spread from China to other parts of Asia and Europe, influencing the textile industries of various civilizations. As these technologies spread along the Silk Roads, they were often adapted and modified to fit the needs and resources of different cultures, leading to further advancements. Medicine was another key area where knowledge flowed along the Silk Roads. The exchange of medical texts, herbs, and healing practices between East and West helped to shape the development of medicine in both regions. For example, Chinese medicine, with its focus on acupuncture, herbal remedies, and holistic approaches to health, influenced medical practices in Central Asia, Persia, and even the Mediterranean. At the same time, Greco-Roman medical knowledge, particularly the works of Hippocrates and Galen, made their way to China and other parts of Asia. This exchange of medical knowledge, which included advancements in anatomy, surgery, and diagnostic techniques, helped shape the way that healthcare was practiced across vast distances. Historians still debate the exact impact of these exchanges on the societies that participated in them. Some argue that the spread of technology and knowledge along the Silk Roads played a crucial role in the development of global civilizations, fostering the rise of empires and the flourishing of intellectual traditions. Others point out that while these exchanges were undoubtedly important, they were often limited in scope and didn't always lead to immediate, widespread changes. Nonetheless, what is clear is that the Silk Roads were not just about material goods. Their true legacy lies in the knowledge and innovations that traveled across them, changing the world in profound ways. As you prepare for your own rest tonight, think of the knowledge that traveled across the Silk Roads, ideas, inventions, and discoveries that transformed societies. Imagine the quiet, steady spread of this wisdom, from one scholar to another, from one culture to another, slowly weaving a fabric of shared learning that would shape the future. Just as those ancient travelers carried their goods and ideas, we too carry knowledge and innovation into the future, shaping the world with every thought and every action. As we continue exploring the rich history of the Silk Roads, it's important to recognize how these ancient trade routes played a significant role in the rise of powerful empires. The Silk Roads weren't just about merchants exchanging goods, they were also a key factor in the growth of empires, fostering political, economic, and cultural dominance. From the Tang dynasty in China to the Roman Empire, the Silk Roads were the lifeblood of expansion and prosperity, helping to connect distant civilizations and allow them to thrive. One of the most notable empires that benefited from the Silk Roads was the Mongol Empire. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols created the largest contiguous empire in history, stretching from China to Eastern Europe. The Mongol Empire's conquests brought vast stretches of land under a single rule, and in the process, the Silk Roads flourished. As the Mongols expanded their empire, they ensured the safety and stability of the trade routes, making it easier for merchants to travel long distances without the constant threat of banditry or warfare. This protection allowed trade to thrive, and goods like silk, spices, and precious metals flowed freely across Asia and into Europe. Historians still debate whether the Mongols truly understood the economic significance of the Silk Roads or whether they were simply motivated by conquest. Some scholars suggest that the Mongols were keenly aware of the value of controlling the Silk Roads, as it allowed them to gather immense wealth and power. Others argue that the Mongols' primary motivation was military expansion, and the growth of trade was a natural byproduct of their conquest. Regardless of the specifics, what is clear is that the Mongol Empire's control over the Silk Roads helped facilitate one of the most prosperous periods of trade in history, benefiting not just the Mongols but the entire Eurasian world. The rise of the Mongol Empire wasn't the only instance of an empire benefiting from the Silk Roads. The Roman Empire, though it existed in a different time, also relied on the trade routes to expand its influence. Romans were eager to gain access to silk, which was a symbol of luxury and power. The Romans had a strong demand for Eastern goods, particularly silk, which became a prized possession among the elite. Through the Silk Roads, Rome was able to trade goods such as wine, glassware, and olive oil in exchange for silk, spices, and precious stones from the East. The Silk Roads helped the Romans maintain a level of economic prosperity that was unmatched in the ancient world. Similarly, the Byzantine Empire, which rose from the ashes of the Roman Empire, relied heavily on the Silk Roads to maintain its strength. The Byzantine Empire controlled key sections of the trade routes, especially through the Mediterranean and into Asia. The city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, became a hub of trade and commerce, benefiting greatly from the flow of goods along the Silk Roads. The Byzantines were also instrumental in the spread of Christianity, which moved along the same routes, carried by missionaries, traders, and soldiers. This further cemented the Silk Roads as a conduit for not just material goods, but also the spread of ideologies and religions. Historians still debate whether the Silk Roads were more responsible for the rise of empires, or whether the empires themselves were simply the natural outcome of larger historical forces. Did the empires grow because they controlled the Silk Roads, or did the Silk Roads thrive because powerful empires ensured their security? Some argue that the Silk Roads were an essential factor in the rise of these empires, while others suggest that the political and military prowess of the empires was the true driving force behind their success. Either way, there's no denying that the Silk Roads played a key role in the economic and political development of these great empires, allowing them to flourish and expand their reach. As you relax tonight and let your thoughts drift, consider the role that the Silk Roads played in the growth of empires. Just as these trade routes helped connect civilizations and foster prosperity in the ancient world, we too are part of a world that is increasingly interconnected. Whether through trade, ideas, or technologies, we continue to build bridges between cultures and communities, shaping our future much as the Silk Roads helped shape the past. The Silk Roads were responsible for connecting distant civilizations and facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and knowledge. However, one of the most significant, and often tragic, consequences of this interconnectivity was the spread of disease. The Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, is often linked to the Silk Roads due to the way it spread from Asia into Europe, carried by traders and travelers who moved along the trade routes. The disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, reached Europe in the 14th century, but it is believed to have spread westward along the same routes that had once carried silk, spices, and other luxuries. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe in the mid-1300s decimated populations and left entire cities in ruins. Historians still argue about the exact origins of the plague, with some suggesting that it began in China or Central Asia, while others point to areas further west. What is clear, however, is that the Silk Roads were instrumental in its spread. The network of trade routes that connected east to west provided an efficient pathway for the movement of people, goods, and, unfortunately, disease. Merchants, travelers, and armies who passed through these routes unwittingly carried the bacteria with them, introducing it to new regions where it would wreak havoc. The Black Death is believed to have been spread by fleas that infested rats, and as these rats traveled on the same caravans and ships that carried merchants, the plague spread rapidly across continents. It is often said that the Mongol Empire played a significant role in the spread of the Black Death, as their vast empire spanned much of the Silk Roads. The Mongol conquests had created a vast, interconnected world where goods and people moved freely, but the same system that facilitated trade also facilitated the movement of the disease. As Mongol soldiers and traders traveled across Eurasia, they unknowingly carried the plague with them, setting the stage for a pandemic that would kill millions. While the Black Death had devastating consequences for the populations of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, historians still debate whether it had a lasting impact on the Silk Roads themselves. Some argue that the plague marked the end of the golden age of the Silk Roads, as the spread of disease discouraged travel and trade across the routes. Others suggest that the decline of the Silk Roads was already in motion due to changing economic and political circumstances, and the plague was simply a contributing factor in their decline. Regardless of the exact reasons, the Black Death, along with other factors like the rise of maritime trade routes and the fall of powerful empires, contributed to the slow but steady decline of the Silk Roads as a primary means of long-distance trade. Even as the plague swept across Europe and Asia, it's important to note that the Silk Roads never completely disappeared. In the wake of the Black Death, the routes continued to function, though on a smaller scale, and over time, new routes and methods of trade emerged, such as the maritime trade routes that connected Europe and Asia. However, the legacy of the Silk Roads, in both positive and negative ways, continued to shape the world long after the Black Death passed. The interconnectedness of the ancient world, while responsible for the spread of the plague, also left a lasting legacy of cultural exchange and shared knowledge that would eventually help the world recover and continue to evolve. As you prepare for sleep tonight, think of the interconnected world of the Silk Roads, a network that brought both prosperity and peril. The same routes that carried precious silk, spices, and cultural knowledge also brought disease, illustrating the complexities of human history. Just as the Silk Roads were essential to the exchange of goods and ideas, they were also a reminder of how interconnected our world can be, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. In the stillness of your rest, let the peaceful passage of time wash over you, much like the way the Silk Roads carried the legacy of the past across continents. As we reflect on the profound impact of the Silk Roads, it's important to understand that historians continue to debate the full extent of their influence on the world. Some argue that the Silk Roads played a pivotal role in shaping global history, fostering economic prosperity, and facilitating cultural exchange. Others, however, suggest that the route's impact may have been overstated, and that other factors, such as the rise of empires, technological advancements, and other trade networks, were more crucial to the development of civilizations. Despite these debates, one thing is clear: the Silk Roads were a major conduit for the movement of goods, ideas, and people, and their legacy continues to resonate today. The debate about the Silk Road's significance centers on whether they were the primary driver of historical change or if they merely reflected broader global shifts that were already underway. On one hand, the sheer volume of trade that occurred along these routes is undeniable. The exchange of goods such as silk, spices, and precious metals led to the rise of powerful empires and the flourishing of cities along the route. Cities like Samarkand, Baghdad, and Chang'an became thriving cultural and economic centers thanks to the commerce that flowed through them. For many, the Silk Roads were a transformative force, shaping the economies and cultures of entire continents. However, there are those who argue that the Silk Roads were not the sole force behind these changes. Some historians point to the rise of maritime trade, which became increasingly important during the Age of Exploration. The development of ocean-based trade routes, particularly during the 15th and 16th centuries, allowed for even greater exchanges of goods and ideas between Europe, Africa, and Asia. In fact, some suggest that the decline of the overland Silk Roads, largely due to the Mongol invasions and the rise of sea trade, was inevitable. The development of new technologies, such as the compass and improved navigation, made maritime trade faster and more efficient, thus shifting the center of global commerce away from the Silk Roads. Another point of debate is the extent to which the cultural and intellectual exchanges along the Silk Roads truly shaped the development of civilizations. It's clear that the movement of ideas, such as the spread of religions like Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, was significant, but how deeply did these exchanges influence the societies they touched? Some scholars argue that while the Silk Roads facilitated the movement of religious ideas and artistic traditions, much of this exchange was more symbolic than transformative. Others contend that the ideas shared along these routes had lasting effects on the development of art, science, and philosophy in both the East and the West, helping to shape the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Ultimately, the impact of the Silk Roads is difficult to measure definitively, as its influence was complex and multifaceted. While some argue that the routes were the catalyst for historical change, others point out that they were just one part of a larger global network of exchange and development. Regardless of where one stands in this debate, it's clear that the Silk Roads played a crucial role in connecting the world, creating pathways for commerce, culture, and communication that continue to influence us today. As you lie down to sleep tonight, think of the far-reaching legacy of the Silk Roads. Picture the merchants, scholars, and travelers who journeyed across continents, exchanging not just goods, but ideas and knowledge. Much like those ancient traders, we too live in an interconnected world, shaped by centuries of cultural exchange and shared history. And while we may not travel on the same routes as those who traversed the Silk Roads, we still find ways to connect and learn from one another, just as they did in times long past. One of the most fascinating legacies of the Silk Roads was how they facilitated the diffusion of cultures across vast distances, changing the course of history in the process. These ancient trade routes were more than just highways for goods, they were pathways for the exchange of ideas, art, religion, technology, and language. As merchants, missionaries, and travelers journeyed along these routes, they didn't just carry silk or spices, they also carried the very essence of their cultures. Over centuries, the Silk Roads allowed for an extraordinary level of cultural mingling, resulting in the blending of Eastern and Western traditions and the birth of new, hybrid cultures. One of the most significant examples of cultural diffusion through the Silk Roads was the spread of religions. Buddhism, which originated in India, traveled along the Silk Roads, eventually reaching China, Korea, Japan, and Central Asia. As Buddhist monks, pilgrims, and traders journeyed along the routes, they brought with them teachings and religious texts that would change the spiritual landscape of East Asia. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Roads is considered one of the most influential cultural exchanges in history, as it impacted art, philosophy, and religious practices in regions far beyond its birthplace. Islam, too, spread along the Silk Roads, traveling from the Arabian Peninsula through Central Asia and into China, India, and even sub-Saharan Africa. The expansion of the Islamic Empire and the movement of Islamic traders and scholars helped to spread not only religious beliefs but also advancements in science, mathematics, and architecture. The Silk Roads played a central role in turning Islam into a global religion, connecting diverse regions and cultures under a shared faith. Similarly, Christianity spread along these routes, especially after the establishment of the Byzantine Empire, and later, during the era of European colonialism. In addition to the spread of religions, the Silk Roads facilitated the exchange of artistic traditions. For instance, Persian, Indian, Chinese, and Greco-Roman art all influenced one another, with motifs and techniques crossing cultural boundaries. The art of glassmaking, for example, traveled from the Roman Empire into the Islamic world and beyond. In return, Islamic cultures brought intricate geometric patterns and calligraphy to the Western world, influencing European art and design. These shared artistic traditions enriched the cultural landscapes of civilizations across the Silk Roads, blending Eastern and Western aesthetics in ways that still resonate today. Historians still argue how much of this cultural exchange was driven by intentional missions versus the natural flow of trade and migration. Some suggest that the spread of religion, art, and knowledge along the Silk Roads was largely a result of conscious efforts by missionaries, traders, and scholars who saw the trade routes as a vehicle for spreading their ideas. Others argue that much of the diffusion was unintentional, driven by the simple fact that these routes were hubs of human interaction, where people from different cultures inevitably exchanged ideas and goods. Regardless of the direction, what's clear is that the Silk Roads were a melting pot of cultures, and the cultural diffusion that took place along them was one of the most defining aspects of this ancient network. In your own quiet moments tonight, consider how much the world of the past influenced the world we live in today. The Silk Roads may have been ancient, but the cultural diffusion that took place across them continues to shape modern society. As you rest, think about how we, too, share knowledge and traditions across the globe, how ideas, like silk, still flow from one culture to another, enriching the tapestry of humanity. Just as the Silk Roads brought distant peoples together, we too find ways to connect, to learn, and to grow through the exchange of ideas. As we continue our journey through the history of the Silk Roads, it's time to address a more somber chapter in their story, their gradual decline. The once thriving trade routes, which had connected civilizations and facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture for centuries, slowly began to lose their importance. This decline was not sudden, but rather the result of several interconnected factors, both internal and external, that led to the eventual cessation of the Silk Roads as the primary conduit for global trade. One of the primary reasons for the decline of the Silk Roads was the rise of maritime trade routes. During the Age of Exploration, which began in the 15th century, European powers like Spain and Portugal began to explore and establish new sea routes to Asia. The discovery of the sea route to India by Vasco da Gama in 1498 marked the beginning of the end for overland trade. As sea travel became faster, safer, and more reliable, it replaced the arduous journey across deserts and mountains that the Silk Roads had once offered. The use of ships, which could carry larger amounts of goods over longer distances with less risk, made maritime trade much more appealing to merchants and traders. At the same time, the Mongol Empire, which had once ensured the safety and stability of the Silk Roads, began to disintegrate. The Mongol conquests had brought vast stretches of land under a single rule, allowing for relatively secure travel across the Silk Roads. However, after the fall of the Mongol Empire in the 14th century, much of the infrastructure that had supported the Silk Roads fell apart. The territories that had once been under Mongol control became fragmented, leading to instability and insecurity along the trade routes. This made travel and trade much riskier, which further decreased the appeal of the overland Silk Roads. Additionally, the rise of powerful empires in the East, such as the Ottoman Empire, led to political shifts that disrupted the flow of goods along the Silk Roads. The Ottoman Empire, in particular, exerted control over key portions of the trade routes in the Middle East and blocked the flow of goods from Asia to Europe. This shift in control, along with the increasing militarization of the region, made the overland trade routes more difficult to navigate, further discouraging merchants from relying on them. Historians still debate the exact timing and reasons behind the decline of the Silk Roads. Was it the rise of maritime trade that led to the downfall, or was the decline more closely tied to the political fragmentation and instability in the regions that once supported the Silk Roads? Some scholars argue that the gradual shift to sea trade was the decisive factor, while others suggest that the political chaos, including the fall of the Mongol Empire and the rise of new empires, was more significant. Still, there's no doubt that the combination of these factors played a crucial role in the eventual decline of the overland routes. Despite the decline of the Silk Roads, the legacy of this vast network of trade and cultural exchange continues to resonate in the modern world. While the routes themselves became less relevant as sea trade took precedence, the ideas, goods, and cultural practices that had spread across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East still linger in our societies today. The exchange of knowledge, technologies, and religious beliefs that took place on the Silk Road set the stage for the interconnected world we live in now, where goods and ideas flow seamlessly across continents, thanks to modern trade routes. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the ways in which the past shapes the present. The decline of the Silk Roads may have marked the end of an era of overland trade, but it also paved the way for new forms of global exchange. Just as the Silk Roads connected distant civilizations long ago, the interconnected world we live in today is the result of centuries of trade, exploration, and cultural diffusion. Though the roads themselves have faded, their impact continues to guide our modern world. While the ancient Silk Roads may have declined over time, their influence didn't vanish. In fact, the legacy of these routes has seen a revival in modern times, adapting to the changing dynamics of the global economy. With the rise of globalization, the spirit of the Silk Roads has been revived in the form of new trade routes, both physical and digital. The concept of connecting East and West, of sharing goods, ideas, and culture, has come full circle, though now, instead of crossing deserts and mountains on horseback, the flow of trade often takes place via highways, railways, and even the internet. The most direct modern equivalent of the ancient Silk Roads is the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, a massive infrastructure and economic development project launched by China in 2013. The BRI aims to reconnect Asia with Europe and Africa through a series of trade routes that mimic the old Silk Roads. The initiative focuses on creating new roads, railways, ports, and energy pipelines to improve trade and foster closer ties between countries across Eurasia. By investing billions of dollars in infrastructure, China has sought to recreate the connections that made the ancient Silk Roads so important, this time, in a modern context. The BRI is more than just about physical infrastructure, it's also about creating new economic corridors. The ancient Silk Roads were not just about the transportation of silk and spices, they were about the exchange of ideas and cultures, the facilitation of communication and cooperation across vast distances. Similarly, the modern BRI includes digital infrastructure projects aiming to create new channels for communication and trade through advanced technology, including 5G networks and e-commerce platforms. This approach mirrors the cross-cultural exchanges that took place along the ancient Silk Roads, where the movement of ideas was just as important as the movement of goods. Historians still argue about the geopolitical implications of the Belt and Road Initiative. Some see it as a new era of global connectivity, potentially offering economic benefits and opportunities for development to underdeveloped regions. Others view it more critically, seeing it as a way for China to extend its influence across Eurasia and Africa, strengthening its position as a global power. Regardless of the political debates, the fact remains that the BRI represents a modern effort to recreate the global connectivity that the ancient Silk Roads fostered, and in many ways, it's more ambitious and expansive than ever before. In addition to the Belt and Road Initiative, the rise of digital trade and e-commerce platforms has brought the spirit of the Silk Roads into the 21st century. The internet has become a new kind of Silk Road, connecting people across continents and facilitating the exchange of goods, services, and ideas at a scale never before possible. Online marketplaces like Alibaba and Amazon have allowed businesses and individuals to buy and sell goods globally, and digital communication platforms have made it easier for people from different cultures to exchange ideas. While the ancient Silk Roads relied on physical movement, the modern Silk Roads often work through fiber optic cables and shipping containers, but the goal of global connection remains the same. As you prepare to settle into rest tonight, think about the ancient Silk Roads and their incredible legacy. The bustling markets, the exchange of goods, the mingling of cultures, all of that continues to shape the way the world operates today. And though the original routes have faded, the idea of interconnectedness remains a fundamental part of our global world. Whether through new infrastructure projects like the Belt and Road Initiative or through the digital networks that connect us all, we are still living in a world shaped by the connections forged on those ancient roads. Just as the past connected distant civilizations, so too do our modern networks connect us across time and space, reminding us of how intertwined our histories truly are. As we near the end of our journey through the incredible story of the Silk Roads, let's take a moment to reflect on the lasting legacy of these ancient trade routes. The impact of the Silk Roads extends far beyond the merchants and empires that used them. It is woven into the very fabric of our modern world. The exchange of goods, ideas, and culture along these routes forever shaped the course of history and continues to influence us today. While the physical Silk Roads may no longer exist in the same way, their spirit lives on in the connections between cultures, the trade that spans continents, and the shared knowledge that continues to flow between East and West. One of the most enduring aspects of the Silk Road's legacy is the continued importance of trade and exchange. Trade routes, both physical and digital, have remained essential to the global economy, much like they were in antiquity. The Silk Roads helped lay the groundwork for the idea of a global economy, where goods could be exchanged over vast distances, bringing prosperity to civilizations and allowing for the sharing of cultures and innovations. Even today, international trade remains at the heart of modern global commerce. The trade routes that were once the lifeblood of empires are now the highways for the movement of goods, ideas, and technology that shape the world we live in. Beyond trade, the Silk Roads also left a lasting cultural and intellectual legacy. The exchange of ideas, philosophies, and religions that occurred along these routes influenced the development of civilizations in ways that are still felt today. Buddhism, for instance, spread from India to China and beyond, shaping the spiritual and cultural landscape of East Asia. Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula through Central Asia and into Southeast Asia, impacting vast regions. Christianity also spread across the Silk Roads, creating cultural and religious bridges between Europe and Asia. These religious movements helped to create a shared spiritual heritage that transcended borders and shaped global culture. The Silk Roads were also responsible for the transmission of knowledge and technology. Papermaking, printing, and gunpowder, each of these inventions traveled from east to west, influencing everything from communication and art to warfare. The ideas and innovations that flowed along the Silk Roads helped to foster intellectual progress, from the ancient libraries of Baghdad to the early scientific developments in Europe. These exchanges of knowledge laid the foundation for the Renaissance and the scientific revolutions that followed, shaping the world as we know it. Historians continue to debate just how transformative the Silk Roads were. Some argue that the routes were the key to the development of world civilizations, while others point to other factors, such as the rise of maritime trade routes, technological advancements, or the growth of powerful empires, as the driving forces behind global connectivity. Still, it's undeniable that the Silk Roads facilitated a level of cross-cultural exchange that had never been seen before. The exchanges that took place on these routes reshaped societies, creating a more interconnected world where ideas, goods, and cultures could blend and grow together. In the modern era, we continue to see echoes of the Silk Roads in the ways our world is connected. The Belt and Road Initiative, as we've seen, aims to revive the ancient trade routes, creating new infrastructure for global trade. At the same time, the digital age has brought us a new form of Silk Road, one where information flows almost instantaneously across the globe, connecting people in ways that were once unimaginable. While the means of connection may have changed, the spirit of the Silk Roads, connecting the East to the West, blending cultures, and sharing ideas, remains a powerful force. As you prepare to drift into sleep tonight, think of the legacy of the Silk Roads, how they shaped the world and how, in many ways, their influence continues to guide our lives today. From the exchange of goods to the sharing of knowledge, these ancient routes helped to forge a global network of connections, and their legacy lives on in the ways we continue to connect, trade, and share ideas with people across the world. The Silk Roads may have faded, but the world they helped create remains, a world that continues to grow, evolve, and intertwine in ways that mirror the ancient exchanges of the past. As we come to the end of this journey along the Silk Roads, it's time to reflect on the extraordinary ways that the past and present are connected. The Silk Roads were more than just trade routes, they were arteries of cultural, intellectual, and spiritual exchange that shaped the development of civilizations across continents. Through these routes, goods and ideas flowed freely, creating a lasting legacy of interconnectedness that still resonates with us today. The connections forged by the Silk Roads were not limited to merchants or empires, they reached into the very hearts of societies, shaping cultures, religions, technologies, and philosophies. The legacy of the Silk Roads can still be seen in how we communicate, how we trade, and how we continue to share and learn from one another across vast distances. Just as the merchants of old carried silk, spices, and precious metals across the world, we now carry information, ideas, and innovations just as quickly and, in some cases, more efficiently. Think about it. In today's world, we live in an era of globalization, where goods travel across the globe daily, where ideas spread instantly through the internet, and where cultural exchanges happen with the click of a button. The Silk Roads were the precursors to this interconnected world, laying the groundwork for the idea that people, no matter their background, could find ways to communicate, trade, and learn from each other. The simple act of a merchant traveling from China to Rome, carrying with him more than just silk but also knowledge, set in motion a flow of ideas that transformed societies and cultures. But as much as the Silk Roads helped bring people together, they also remind us of the complexities of human history, the costs of war, disease, and the unintended consequences of such interconnectedness. The Black Death, which spread along these same roads, shows us that the same routes that carry prosperity can also carry devastation. The story of the Silk Roads is not a simple one, it is a story of both wonder and tragedy, of the potential for greatness and the cost of global connection. As we lay down to rest tonight, take a moment to think about the many threads of history that connect us to the past. The Silk Roads, in their physical and symbolic forms, remind us that we are part of a long continuum of human experience, where each idea, invention, or trade agreement continues to ripple through time. The goods and ideas exchanged along these ancient routes shaped the world we live in, just as the ways we connect today will shape the world of tomorrow. In a way, we too are part of the modern Silk Roads, whether we realize it or not. Our daily interactions, the exchange of ideas, our ability to trade and learn from one another, mirror the connections made by those who traveled those ancient routes. The legacy of the Silk Roads lives on not just in history books, but in the way we interact with the world today. So, as you fall into a peaceful sleep, think of how the roads that once brought distant civilizations together are now within our grasp, connecting us across time and space.